Lots of people believe in the abstract theory of alien life, but some people believe aliens have not only visited Earth, they actually placed a mysterious device into orbit above our planet thousands of years ago that they used to communicate with humanity. Sounds crazy? Here's a look at the mystery of the Black Knight satellite. First sighting. In 1954, the New York Times ran an article saying that Dr. Lincoln La Paz had discovered 2 satellites orbiting the Earth. The reason this was news? In 1954, no country had managed to launch any satellites yet. Whatever La Paz saw, it was enough to worry the Pentagon for a while that the Russians might have beaten America into space. La Paz later said he made it all up, while the Army said no such satellites existed. Still, many people believe the satellites were there, and they were made by aliens. The Tesla connection. Nikola Tesla is the internet's favorite scientist and is famous for lots of other things too, like inventing the Tesla coil, his dislike of women, and his strange obsession with pigeons. In 1899, though, he made his most controversial discovery when he claimed to have received an electric signal sent by aliens. He even published an article for Collier's Weekly, subtly titled "Talking with the Planets," where he theorized the signal was from Mars. Modern conspiracy theorists, however, believe Tesla was actually intercepting a message from the Black Knight satellite. The next communication. According to Vice, in 1927, a Norwegian engineer named Jürgen Hals was listening to radio signals when he noticed that some of them had a strange echo. Despite turning to other physicists for help, Hals could never explain these long-delayed radio echoes, but some believe the answer is pretty obvious. Space race sighting. By the end of the 1950s, the space race was in full swing, and both the US and USSR had managed to put satellites in orbit. But according to Skeptoid, on February 11, 1960, a radar used by the US Navy picked up the presence of a strange, dark, tumbling object that didn't belong to either country. Americans freaked out, worried that it was a new Soviet satellite, but Time magazine announced it was just an innocent piece of space junk. However, thanks to declassified documents, we now know that it was a cover-up, as it was actually an American spy satellite doing reconnaissance on Russia. But is that just another layer to the deeper cover-up of the Black Knight satellite? The lost tape. Even the French managed to get in on the conspiracy action. In 1961, a scientist named Jacques Vallée made a startling discovery. There was a bright, unidentified object in retrograde, meaning it was moving in the opposite direction of Earth's rotation. The technology to put satellites in retrograde is available to humanity now, but didn't exist at the time. When Vallée showed a recording of his findings, though, his superior confiscated the tape and erased the footage. Nobody knows why, but some people believe it's because the lost tape showed proof of the existence of the Black Knight satellite. Or maybe... An astronaut's alleged sighting. Mercury 7 astronaut Gordon Cooper would seem to be a reliable source, so many conspiracy theorists put great stock in the rumor that Cooper saw the Black Knight satellite while orbiting the Earth. Allegedly, up to 100 more people on Earth even saw the satellite on their radar while tracking Cooper's flight. One problem though, according to Skeptoid, Cooper was adamant that his sighting of the Black Knight was made up by UFO fanatics. So what's the truth? Only the aliens know for sure. The people of Epsilon Boötis. In the 1970s, science fiction author Duncan Lennon took those radio echoes Jürgen Hals discovered in the 1920s and mapped them against constellations. He concluded that the signals were from the star Epsilon Boötis and claimed the decoded message said this: "Our home is Epsilon Boötis, which is a double star. We live on the 6th planet of 7. Check that, the 6th of 7 counting outwards from the Sun, which is the larger of the 2 stars. Our 6th planet has 1 moon. Our 4th planet has 3. Our 1st and 3rd planet each have 1. Our probe is in the orbit of your moon." Lennon later withdrew his claims, but theorists believe the mention of a probe orbiting the moon is actually talking about the Black Knight satellite orbiting Earth. Recent sightings. In 1998, the crew of Space Shuttle Endeavour photographed something in orbit that looked very similar to other images of the alleged Black Knight satellite. However, it was concluded that it was probably just a thermal blanket that had been lost in space. In 2015, there were at least 2 sightings, including an object passing in front of the moon and footage of the satellite hovering over Florida before disappearing. And in April 2017, there was footage released to tabloids that supposedly showed an Illuminati rocket blowing up the Black Knight satellite. The jury is still out on this one, but one thing is for sure, if that rocket was fired by the person who actually killed JFK, we could finally be close to getting some real answers.
What was Charlie Rich thinking when he announced John Denver as the CMA's Entertainer of the Year? What is Bobby Gentry's Ode to Billie Joe really about? When exactly did Hank Williams die? These classic country mysteries may never be solved. Jim Sullivan was a country blues musician with an edge of the psychedelic. He released 2 albums over the course of his career, and he had famous friends like actor Dennis Hopper. Then he disappeared and was never seen again. Sullivan had a family, but left them behind to go to Nashville for work, except that he never actually showed up. His wife Barbara got a call from him on March 5, 1975, the day after he left California. She asked him to tell her what was wrong, but he refused, as he instead said, "You wouldn't believe it if I told you. Forget it. Just forget I said anything." That was their last phone call. Sullivan's car was found abandoned 3 days later in the small town of Santa Rosa, New Mexico. It contained his ID, a box of his albums, and his beloved guitar. The police investigation turned up no clues about where Jim was or why he disappeared. One local named Donald Sena thought that they didn't do a great job, though. As he put it, "I always thought there was something strange about how that went down, why they didn't investigate it more." A search by family members and volunteers was more thorough. According to newspaper reporter Davey Delgado, there was no arroyo left unturned and no trace of him found. Hank Williams Sr. is one of the most famous country stars of all time, despite dying at the age of 29. Weirdly, no one knows exactly when he died. As reported by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution on New Year's Eve 1952, a 17-year-old Charles Carr was driving Williams 500 miles to get to a gig the next day. He realized that something was wrong with his passenger in the back seat in the early morning hours and detoured to a hospital. Williams was pronounced dead there, with January 1st, 1953 appearing as the date on his death certificate.
Hank Williams' last journey began in Knoxville and ended in tragedy just up the road.
But some people have different ideas about when Williams breathed his last. Tennessee Highway Patrol Corporal Swan Kitts pulled Carr over at 1 a.m. that morning for driving erratically and saw Williams in the back seat. He reported that the musician already, quote, looked dead, but was reassured by Carr that he was just under the power of a sedative. Could those injections of morphine given to him at a Knoxville hotel before getting back on the road have been what killed him? The doctor who gave them obviously didn't think so, as he said, "The shots I gave Williams had absolutely nothing to do with his death. It is ridiculous to think that they did." But sometime after receiving the injections, William had to be brought to the car in a wheelchair. Some believe that he was already dead at that point, and his corpse was put in the car by people who thought that he was just out of it. After a decade of country music success, Bobby Gentry decided that performing had lost its appeal, so she went back to her normal life. She hasn't made a public appearance since 1981, but she left behind a mystery in a song that's been driving fans crazy ever since. Ode to Billie Joe tells the story of a girl who finds out during a family dinner that a boy named Billie Joe has killed himself by jumping off the Tallahatchie Bridge. It's implied that she and Billie Joe were sweet on each other and that they'd been spotted throwing something into the river below that same bridge shortly before he died. What did they throw? We may never find out. Gentry once explained her reasoning for keeping this important detail so vague by saying, "First, it locks up a definite relationship between Billie Joe and the girl telling the story, the girl at the table. Second, the fact that Billie Joe was seen throwing something off the bridge, no matter what it was, provides a possible motivation as to why he jumped off the bridge the next day." As for the item that they threw, Gentry has never revealed what it was, although she's been asked all the time by fans and heard many theories like an engagement ring, a draft card, or even a baby. Eventually, a TV movie based on the song provided its own answer of the girl's childhood doll, but that really disappointed fans.
Don't seem like no good never come to nobody on this bridge.
Country star Jim Reeves had a weird connection to John F. Kennedy's assassination. The biography Jim Reeves' Untold Story, written by Larry Jordan, records a Texas radio station owner's account of what happened as news of the assassination unfolded in November 1963. As Lee Harvey Oswald's picture was shown on TV, Reeves told everyone who was watching that he recognized Oswald from seeing him on multiple occasions at the Longhorn Ballroom, where Reeves and his band often performed. It's also been contended that Reeves knew Oswald's killer, Jack Ruby, from the same place. In August the following year, Reeves was killed in a small private plane crash, and he had something mysterious with him. As songwriter John Loudermilk recounted, music producer Chet Atkins called me and said, "Jim's down. He crashed last night. We need to go out and find him." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "He's got a briefcase that has some important papers in it that are private, and nobody should have those." That briefcase was never found, and the mystery deepened. While researching his biography, Larry Jordan got a phone call from someone who claimed to work for American intelligence and warned him to avoid looking too deeply into Reeves' crash. Charlie Rich had a 35-year career that included 11 #1 records on the country charts and an Entertainer of the Year award from the Country Music Association of America in 1974. That honor meant that he would present the same award the following year, but that's when his career went up in flames, literally. Rich announced that John Denver was the winner, but then he did something inexplicable. As he took a step back and fished in his pocket for a lighter, then he lit the envelope on fire. Denver wasn't there to see this, but the audience was gobsmacked. What exactly was Rich trying to say? He never explained himself, so it's been left to others to theorize about his mysterious action, which incidentally got him banned from all future CMA award shows. Many people think he was mad about Denver's win, possibly because he didn't think he was really a country musician. There's also the fact that Rich has admitted that at the time he was on prescription pain medication that he washed down with multiple gin and tonics. His son Charlie Jr. had his own theory. He used bad judgment. He was human after all. I know the last thing my father would have wanted to do was set himself up as judge of another musician. Bobby Mackey's Music World is a popular honky-tonk in Kentucky, owned by the country singer of the same name. There is a sign on the door that reads, "Warning to our patrons. This establishment is purported to be haunted. Management is not responsible and cannot be held liable for any actions of any ghosts/spirits on these premises." The bar has appeared on many ghost hunting shows and is purported to be the site of many grisly crimes over the years. Almost all of it is legend, but one horrific crime did take place nearby, and the victim is said to be one of the ghosts that haunts the building today. In 1896, 5 months pregnant Pearl Bryan arrived in Cincinnati, Ohio in order to procure an abortion. The father of her child and his roommate were waiting for her at the train station. What happened next is a mystery, but somehow Bryan ended up dead. When her body was found, it was missing its head. Despite extensive searches, the head was never found. One legend says that it was thrown into an already bloody well of a nearby slaughterhouse across the river in Kentucky, and the building that housed the slaughterhouse is now the home of Bobby Mackey.
I don't know if I would be adamant about Bobby Mackey's closing its doors, but I think something will do it for them.
There's only one known photo of the Weems String Band, as they literally appeared out of nowhere and disappeared right after. During the 1920s, hillbilly string band music was all the rage, and the Weems String Band recorded a single record for Columbia. Their playing style made the band even more mysterious. Despite living in the backcountry of Perry County, Tennessee, they held and played their instruments in distinctive ways that indicated they almost certainly had professional violin training, which seems impossible for people who came from somewhere so remote. Plus, one of the members played the cello, which you normally wouldn't find in a string band. And they didn't play in the normal style either, instead producing what was essentially an experimental record at a time when no one in the genre was doing anything like that. The record they produced had an A-side called Greenback Dollar as well as a B-side. That was all these virtuosos ever recorded. There are 6 people in the photo, and we only know 4 of them: Dick, Frank, and Jesse Weems, and their brother-in-law Alvin Condor. The other 2 are thought to be younger Weems brothers, but their names were lost to history. That is, until a member of the online forum Banjo Hangout contended that the other 2 were Atlas Dodge Condor and Ray Hinson. The explanation was anecdotal, so whether or not it's true is up to folk tradition. William Curly Sheldon was a member of the band Dixie Six, stars of the 1950s TV program Hillside Hoedown. He was also a confirmed ladies' man. The mysterious story of his death was recounted in 2019 by the Evansville Courier and Press. According to local bar owner Oswald Combs, Curly was something else. He sang those old love ballads and women just went crazy. He had no trouble getting all the women he wanted. But this would become a problem. Sheldon once told Henderson, Kentucky County Sheriff Lee Williams that a man wanted to kill him. When Williams asked why that was, Sheldon admitted that he'd been with his wife multiple times, so the sheriff told him to leave that man's wife alone. 3 years after that conversation, on December 5, 1957, Sheldon was found in his car outside a VFW hall. He'd been beaten to death, pummeled so badly that the cops who arrived on the scene mistakenly thought he'd been shot in the head. Despite an extensive investigation in which over 100 people were questioned, nobody was ever arrested, let alone convicted for the murder. But Sheriff Williams claimed to know what the motive would have been, as he told the Evansville Courier at the time, Sheldon was caught with a woman by a man, maybe the woman's husband, and the man simply beat him to death. That's my theory, and I'm sticking to it. In 1978, First Lady of Country Music Tammy Wynette told People magazine about the terrifying carjacking and kidnapping she'd been the victim of a few weeks earlier. As she recounted, "I felt a poke in my side and heard a man's voice say, 'Drive.' All I could see was a brown glove, a lot of hair on his arm, and 2 inches of gun barrel. Wynette was finally released 80 miles from Nashville as she then fled for help. She had visible injuries on her face and neck where the kidnapper had punched, slapped, and strangled her, but there's a lot of reason to doubt Wynette's story. Her children contend that she was in an abusive marriage and the injuries were caused by her husband, their stepfather, George Ritchie. Her daughter, Georgette Jones, wrote in her memoir, The Three of Us, she did admit to my sister that when all that stuff came out about her being kidnapped in 1978, that she and Ritchie had been in a fight and he had beaten her. He threatened to destroy her life and write a tell-all book, so she decided to stay with him, so he concocted the kidnapping story for PR. Ritchie has called the abuse accusations preposterous, and Wynette never publicly recanted her kidnapping story. Murder, death, and strange disappearances. What sent a beam of light from space, and who was behind the soft drink spokesman who took over TV and showed his butt live on air? The 80s don't get stranger than this. If you ever wondered why over-the-counter medicine is so hard to get into, from foil seals to cotton ball stoppers, it can all be traced to one of the most notorious unsolved mysteries in American law enforcement. The Tylenol murders were a series of suspicious deaths occurring in and around the Chicago area in 1982. The 7 fatalities had no pattern, but autopsies determined that all the victims had taken the pain reliever Tylenol just before they died. According to PBS, officials discovered the pills involved had been laced with potassium cyanide.
We've been receiving calls about once every 15 seconds. At Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's, we only have 3 poison lines.
The CDC lists potassium cyanide as a chemical asphyxiant that can kill with extreme swiftness. It's an incredibly adept chemical with applications in mining, jewelry making, and fumigation. According to Crime Museum, Johnson & Johnson reacted at once, releasing a massive public warning, halting production, and yanking 31 million bottles of Tylenol off the shelves. The investigation determined the tampering of pills occurred from different factories and only after they left for sale, but no suspect was ever identified. Congress made drug tampering a federal offense, but the police remain stumped. The case remains open, but Tylenol quickly changed their advertising.
Tylenol, safety sealed for your protection.
He was a victim of the Cold War. This is the most plausible theory behind the mystery of Vladimir Alexandrov. According to El País, Alexandrov confirmed the American hypothesis of a nuclear winter, a massive global temperature drop stemming from a nuclear war. It turned him into an overnight science superstar. Unusual for a Soviet scientist at the time, Alexandrov was allowed extensive international travel privileges to collaborate in the United States and Europe. Things unspooled in 1985 when Alexandrov, then 47, traveled to Spain. He gave a talk in Cordoba and then moved on to Madrid, where he had a meeting with Soviet officials. Journalist Andrew Revkin documented that the meeting left Alexandrov so shaken he went on a drinking bender. Revkin confirmed that Alexandrov was habitually inebriated. And then Vladimir Alexandrov vanished. No note, no body. According to El País, the conspiracy theories were vast, like the KGB killed him for becoming too Americanized or the CIA killed him for being a Soviet spy. But the scientist disappeared so completely that nothing made sense. The dissolution of the USSR in 1991 led to no opening of records on Alexandrov, and a 2016 article at pulitzercenter.org concludes that Alexandrov is dead, but no one knows for sure. Scientific American states, it's not aliens. In fact, it is never aliens. But no list of unsolved mysteries is complete without them. The Rendlesham Forest incident is the UK's most famous UFO legend. In 1980, American soldiers stationed at RAF Woodbridge reported seeing unidentified lights in the sky descending into the nearby Rendlesham Forest. And according to the BBC, the same thing happened 2 days later. Locals then reported a pair of suited men appearing and asking if anyone had seen anything.
Do you want to report a UFO? Over. Negative.
According to the BBC, the incident slipped into obscurity until 3 years later, when the famously sensational News of the World tabloid ran a story based on a real USAF document that a UFO landed in England. The story gained more traction when The Guardian reported on Rendlesham in 1985. As the BBC describes, the locals scoff at the idea and that the beam from the Orford Ness lighthouse was likely the light source. But why spoil the fun? There's a UFO walking trail at Rendlesham, and the mystery is the source of several books, even a movie. But what exactly happened that night in 1980? No one knows. Natalie Wood was a Hollywood rarity, a child star who became a box office smash as an adult, with roles in Rebel Without a Cause and West Side Story. According to IMDb, Wood had 3 Golden Globe wins and 3 Oscar nominations. But like Marilyn Monroe before her, Wood's death is so fraught with theories and conspiracies that she's possibly more famous for dying than acting. According to the Los Angeles Times, in 1981, Wood, her husband, actor Robert Wagner, and their friend, actor Christopher Walken, took a nighttime cruise on a yacht. Then Wood, who had been drinking and could not swim, vanished. Wagner radioed in his wife's disappearance at 1:30 a.m., and her body was recovered later that morning. Town & Country states that Wagner found that both Wood and the dinghy attached to the yacht were missing. The coroner found bruising on Wood's body consistent with a fall, and her death was listed as accidental. But the case was reopened in 2011 after new details emerged and a new witness came forward in 2018. In 2012, The Guardian stated that Wood's cause of death was changed from an accident to drowning and other undetermined factors. No one has been formally charged as of yet, but 41 years later, the mysterious death of Natalie Wood remains unsolved. On November 22, 1987, Chicago was left bewildered when the nightly news on WGN-TV was suddenly replaced by a figure wearing a Max Headroom mask. For background, Max Headroom was an icon of the 1980s. The Verge describes the character as a dystopian deconstructionist critique of corporate greed. The figure remained silent and merely bobbed on screen for 25 seconds before station engineers re-established control. Then it happened again. Chicago area PBS affiliate WTTW-11 was hacked 2 hours later by the same figure, who now spoke in a stream of consciousness ramble through a voice distortion effect for 2 minutes. Along with the gibberish, the hacker signed off by giving viewers an eyeful when he mooned the camera and was spanked by a woman with a fly swatter. The Max Headroom hack has gone down in history as one of the most infamous signal piratings in American television, augmented by the fact no one knows who did it. Atlas Obscura describes how in 2010, a Reddit user went into astonishingly exact detail on why the hack was performed, claiming that 2 unnamed techies wanted to demonstrate the vulnerability of American technology. The claims made were never confirmed. On December 12, 1985, 248 American soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division, nicknamed the Screaming Eagles, died in Newfoundland, Canada, when their plane, Aeroflight 1285, fell from the sky and crashed. The crash killed everyone on board, including the 8 crew members. The Fort Campbell Courier reported, "The crash was the largest single-day tragedy with loss of life in Screaming Eagle history." Even as families mourned and communities rallied, the Canadian Aviation Safety Board rushed to figure out how the plane, not 1,000 feet off the ground, suddenly crashed. There was no indication of general wrongdoing concerning Aeroflight 1285, and the mystery lacks a good theory that everyone accepts. According to the Fort Campbell Courier, the crash was officially blamed on ice buildup due to the notoriously harsh Newfoundland winter. But the CBC claimed that an investigator was so unconvinced of those findings that he filed a minority report. A similar article from the Cape Cod Times stated that an explosion in the cargo hold actually took Aeroflight 1285 down. And some reports say that the flight originated in the Middle East, leading some to raise questions of terrorism, UPI noted. The cause remains a mystery. How does a man get shot dead in broad daylight, a crime witnessed by 60 people, and no suspect gets caught? All-out criminal Ken Rex McElroy terrorized the people of Skidmore, Missouri. According to local affiliate Fox 2, the man was suspected of theft, livestock rustling, burglary, arson, assault, and child molestation. He impregnated a 12-year-old girl, and to avoid statutory charges, married the girl after an intimidation campaign against her parents. As Fox reports, intimidation was how McElroy got away with 20 charges against him, with crimes going back into the 1970s. According to Bustle, McElroy successfully and suspiciously appealed a murder conviction in July 1981. He then died in a hail of bullets. No one called an ambulance. No one rushed to help. No one saw a thing. The case and the wall of silence around the incident made headlines. Bustle alleges that McElroy earned the hatred of Skidmore so completely, not only did the entire town conspire to kill him, people refused to point fingers. The New York Times reports witnesses admitting seeing the shooting occur but not the shooter, and the people of Skidmore have no desire to see the case progress.
Who pulled the trigger?
I don't know. I couldn't tell you.
Would you turn in the person who did it?
Starting in 1987, an unknown man in a black balaclava started a serial spree of child sexual assaults, abductions, and at least one murder across the city of Melbourne that has kept Australia on edge ever since. Dubbed Mr. Cruel by the press, the police identified only a very basic modus operandi. Each victim was monitored before the attack. Abducted victims were later found by electrical substations, leading to the assumption Mr. Cruel worked for the Power Authority. According to the Herald-Sun, each of the 12 attacks was careful and unhurried. A conscientious and self-aware criminal, Mr. Cruel even went so far as to provide false leads. While surviving victims were able to provide some information, the Herald-Sun details how each was gagged and carefully blindfolded, limiting their abilities. In 1991, the attacks suddenly stopped, leaving police no closer to solving the case. According to the Herald-Sun, 7 suspects were identified by law enforcement, but no progress was made on any. With no new leads, the task force assigned to Mr. Cruel disbanded in 1994, and in the decades since, some sources question if Mr. Cruel is still alive. Arguably the most famous missing person of the decade, Toledo, Ohio resident Cynthia Anderson was a stereotypical church-going good girl. On an ordinary day in 1981, she disappeared into thin air, and she hasn't been seen or heard from since. According to the case file with the Ohio Attorney General, Anderson, a legal secretary, had prepared the working day for her superiors. The radio was on and an unfinished romance novel was on her desk. The Charlie Project states that Anderson's purse and keys were missing, but her locked car was still in the parking lot. There was no sign of a struggle, and the office door was locked. The Toronto Blade notes calls to the office started going unanswered at 10 a.m. She had also place-marked her book at a scene involving an abduction by knife point. The strongest clue was that Anderson was subject to a series of disturbing phone calls and eerie messages. Parade reveals that the words, "I love you, Cindy," signed by GW, had been spray-painted on the opposite wall of her office. The stalking behavior unsettled Anderson so much that an alarm buzzer was installed at her workplace. It was never used. Police were stumped. According to the Charlie Project, suspects were pursued, including convicted felons, but to no avail. Anderson was gone. The case remains open. According to a Plumas County News retrospective from April 2018, the signed message, "I paid the price of your love, and now I bought it with 4 people's lives," is considered all but a confession to the Ketty Cabin murders, a brutal family slain in 1981. 2 suspects were even identified, but the case still went cold. ThoughtCo reports that the bodies of Glenda Sue Sharp, her son John Sharp, and his friend Dana Wingate were discovered killed in a cabin in the small Northern California community of Ketty. Missing was the Sharp daughter, 12-year-old Tina, whose remains were found in the woods 3 years later. Found at the scene were the murder weapons and, astonishingly, the 3 other children who went the entire episode unharmed in another room. Plumas County News has authorities surmising at least 2 perpetrators, but a piece published a week earlier says as many as 6 could be involved. Authorities looked at Martin Smart, who wrote the quotation, and Severin John Bobade for connections. As ThoughtCo observes, police infighting froze the case so thoroughly that it remains unsolved to this day. The Sacramento Bee noted new technology is shedding some light, but both Smart and Bobade have since died, dimming hopes for justice. In a 2016 interview with People, survivor Sheila Sharp said she just wants answers. Sharp said in the newly found evidence,
"I actually put in my mind that I'll probably go to my grave, that it will never be solved."
Sometimes a criminal case becomes an enduring mystery because the facts seem so ludicrous. In 1989, the Fukushima authorities in Japan suspected Naoki Kano died in a ladies' room septic tank of hypothermia in a failed attempt to watch women in the restroom. While this would seem like an extreme Peeping Tom case, the surrounding facts don't add up. According to Day News, town folks immediately came to Kano's defense when police announced the predatory theory, saying he was a father and an apparent pillar of the community. But no one knows how he got into the tank in the first place. The C-shaped industrial pipe was so cramped that the 26-year-old Kano was wedged inside. Kano was found on his back in a fetal position, shirtless, holding a neatly folded jacket to his chest with no outward injuries. He would have been looking up into the urinal, and he ultimately ended up freezing to death. Dissatisfied with the official findings, 4,000 locals demanded the case be reinvestigated. No further clues were found, and no suspects were ever identified. The case remains cold. Turncoat or tragedy, flight or foul play. The inexplicable disappearance of Richard Cox remains a compelling mystery. Richard Colvin Cox was born in Mansfield, Ohio in 1928, and after graduating high school, Cox volunteered for the United States Constabulary. That was a force organized in the wake of World War II, tasked with providing security and policing services in a shattered Germany. He was assigned to a unit in Coburg, Germany, and the military life obviously appealed to him. Life reports he applied to and entered West Point as a student in 1948. All the evidence points to Cox being well suited for military life. His service in Germany was quite admirable, and when he applied to West Point, his application was supported by his superiors and went through without a problem. Once in West Point, he continued to thrive in the military lifestyle. By all reports, he did well at the academy. He ranked in the upper third of his class and had no blemishes on his record. Richard Cox seemed on his way to having a solid, if not exemplary, military career, and most importantly, he seemed well suited for such a life. When someone vanishes without a trace, it's easy to imagine they must have been terribly unhappy or in some kind of trouble. Why else would you walk out of your life and never look back, leaving friends, family, and lovers with no closure? But according to the Washington Post, in the days and weeks before Richard Colvin Cox vanished, there were exactly 0 clues that he was contemplating such a dramatic decision. Right up until the day before his disappearance, he remained in contact with his fiancée Betty and his mother Minnie, who stated that there had been no indication he was contemplating leaving West Point, and that she had no reason to suspect any sort of crime. Cox had, in fact, just returned from Christmas vacation at home with his family, and according to Life was, at most, sometimes depressed. However, that's hardly unusual for young people in high-pressure environments like West Point. Cox spent a day taking in a basketball game with his roommate Dean E. Welch, not exactly the actions of a worried man, and then on January 14, 1950, he vanished without a trace. Here's where things start to get dark. According to Life, 1 week before Cox disappeared, a man telephoned his barracks asking for Dick Cox and left his name as George. He stated that they knew each other from Germany. The Washington Post reports that Cox met with George but offered a negative impression of the man to his roommates. He'd made a few shocking comments about George, saying he'd boasted about how many men he'd killed and that he'd murdered a girlfriend when she became pregnant.
Wow, sounds like a cool guy.
Sounds like a jerk.
A week later, Cox once again met a civilian friend and signed himself out for dinner. Although it seems very likely it was the same man, there were differences in how the civilian was described by a different set of witnesses. When Cox returned to his room, however, he had indicated it was George and that they had again made plans to have dinner together. Unfortunately, George was never identified, despite an intense search for him after Cox's disappearance. The Washington Post makes it clear that there's a strong possibility of foul play when it comes to the matter of Cox's disappearance, especially considering that his behavior wasn't entirely innocent. According to Hudson Valley Magazine, when Cox left the barracks with his mysterious friend George a week before his disappearance, the two men simply sat in George's car drinking whiskey. Cox returned to his room intoxicated and quickly passed out at his desk. His roommates, amused, even took a photo of him as he slept as a prank. Author Harry J. Mayhoffer describes some of Cox's more suspicious behavior in his book Oblivion, The Mystery of West Point Cadet Richard Cox, noting that at some point Cox crept from his room and altered the entry in the barracks logbook to make it seem as if he'd returned an hour earlier than he actually had. This was a violation of the cadet honor code at West Point, and it may have resulted in his expulsion if discovered, so it wasn't something a cadet would do lightly. What was so important about that hour? When Cox arrived at West Point, he was engaged to a woman named Betty Timmons back in Ohio. However, things took an interesting turn as Cox slept off his first meeting with George. Front Page Detectives reports that at some point, Cox woke from his drunken slumber, ran out into the hall, and shouted the name Alice. His roommate asked him who Alice was, but Cox ignored him, returned to his room, and fell asleep again. Since Cox's fiancée was named Betty, this could be a clue as to his eventual fate, or his relationship to the mysterious man named George. But no Alice has ever been identified in connection with Cox. It's been speculated that Alice might have been a girlfriend of Cox's in Germany, but no such woman has ever been found. When Richard Colvin Cox initially disappeared, the focus of most theories was foul play. Had Cox been kidnapped, murdered, suffered a breakdown? West Point continued to list Cox as away without official leave, or AWOL, instead of charging him with the more serious crime of desertion. But there was no evidence to support any of these theories, really, which has led some to posit the other possibility, that despite the appearance of happiness, Cox voluntarily vanished and left his life behind and never looked back. Assembly notes that a review of Cox's writings reveals some dissatisfaction with his West Point experience and some doubts about marrying Betty. Front Page Detectives reports that January 15, 1950, the day after his disappearance, was circled on his calendar with no indication as to why. And for years after Cox's disappearance, people reported seeing him. The tantalizing possibility remains that Cox left his life behind, assumed a new identity, and spent the rest of his days hiding from his family and old friends. It may be tempting to simply chalk up Cox's disappearance to a young man looking to flee his obligations. However, there's evidence against the idea that he simply abandoned his own life to start anew as well. One reason many people don't believe Cox had a plan to disappear deliberately is the fact that he left several items behind in his room that would have been extremely useful to him if he had. First, as reported in Oblivion, he left behind a large sum of money. A search of his room after his disappearance found $60 in cash and a check for $25 made out to him. In today's money, that would have been worth more than $1,000. He also left a gold watch that his roommate stated he had seemed to value highly. According to front-page detectives, Cox also left 2 suitcases of civilian clothing behind in his room. They had just been returned from the cleaners, yet he left them there and wore his uniform and gray overcoat when he left, making it very difficult for him to blend in once he left the West Point grounds. Life reports that it took some time for the alarm to sound concerning Cox's disappearance. He was officially due back in his room by 11 p.m. at night, but cadets were routinely late and no one thought much about his failure to turn up. It wasn't until the next morning that Cox was officially reported missing. Richland's source reports that what ensued was one of the largest manhunts ever staged in U.S. history. Helicopters were deployed to search the West Point grounds for a body, and soldiers were brought in to form search parties. The pool was drained, and every nearby building was searched. The massive manhunt went on for 2 long months and turned up exactly 0 clues. West Point continued to call Cox's name at roll call every morning for 3 months, finally removing him from the rolls on March 15, 1950. The Washington Post says that in 1957, the state of Ohio officially declared him dead. The investigation remained a cold case. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence suggesting Cox may have vanished on purpose was noted by the Washington Post. Purportedly, Cox was spotted some 4 years after his disappearance at a Greyhound bus station in Washington, D.C. He was seen there by a man named Ernest J. Shotwell Jr., who had attended the U.S. Military Academy Preparatory School with Cox a few years before his entry into West Point and subsequent disappearance. According to Shotwell, he wasn't aware that Cox was missing when he saw him, and he reported that Cox seemed ill at ease and evaded questions about his future. Per Oblivion, Shotwell was asked if he would be willing to take a lie detector test to support his claims, and he said that he would. By 1950, the Cold War was in full swing and provided a backdrop for what was a very real concern. As historian Yohuru Williams explains,
during the 1940s and 1950s, many Americans worried about the prospects of communism rearing its head within the United States.
So when Cox vanished from West Point, it's no surprise that some investigators looked at the case through the lens of espionage, and it didn't come up entirely empty. According to Oblivion, notes Cox left behind indicated he was making an attempt to learn how to speak Russian. The Washington Post reports this was confirmed in a letter Cox had written to a woman in Germany just a few weeks before his disappearance, in which he also asked pointedly, "What is the Russian situation in Lichtenfels and vicinity? I'm very interested in the Russian situation." The rest of the contents of the letter were pretty generic, harmless stuff, with Cox simply desiring correspondence and expressing uncertainty that the woman would even remember who he was. Neither of these pieces of evidence proves anything, of course, but considering how thoroughly he vanished, the possibility that he crossed over to the Soviets at the height of the Cold War can't be completely discounted. Hudson Valley Magazine reports that Cox served as an intelligence officer, and there are reasons to think it possible that Cox's 1950 disappearance had everything to do with becoming a spy. According to Richland's source, an old friend of Cox's, William F. McKee, eventually became Richland County prosecutor. While in the Ohio FBI office one day, McKee asked to see the bureau's file on Cox, and the agent became flustered and gave excuses why the file couldn't be produced. A few years later, he made another request to see the Cox file, and once again, the files never showed up. In 1982, a journalist was finally able to get the Cox file and discovered it was heavily censored, and 165 pages were simply missing. The whole experience implies that someone in a position to do so wanted to prevent anyone from seeing the results of the investigation into Cox's disappearance. It may be possible the FBI wanted to keep the details secret due to the embarrassment over the lack of progress. However, it's also consistent with the idea that Cox, who had experience working in intelligence, was recruited by the CIA or some other agency. In Oblivion, author Harry J. Mayhofer reports on the likelihood that Cox was recruited into the CIA. At the time of his disappearance, the CIA was actively recruiting former soldiers with experience serving outside the U.S.
We will now determine your G-force threshold. Just relax, gentlemen.
I guess we just sit here?
Since Cox had some experience working in intelligence in Germany, he was ideally qualified. Some investigators speculated that the mysterious man called George, who visited Cox shortly before he vanished, was in fact a man named David Westervelt. Westervelt had supervised Cox in Germany and may have been a recruiter for the CIA. According to front-page detectives, a former FBI agent stated that the Bureau had been within 24 hours of catching Cox, but were abruptly removed from the case, leading them to suggest that a higher authority was protecting him. In fact, a highly placed CIA officer confirmed that Richard Colvin Cox was still alive but had no desire to come forward and speak to anyone. The CIA contact also implied that Cox was ill with cancer and on his deathbed. A possibility that this was a falsehood designed to discourage further inquiry is possible, of course, and the disappearance of Richard Colvin Cox remains a mystery to this day.
For decades, the case of America's most famous skyjacking has gone unsolved. Given the lack of hard evidence, reliance on eyewitness testimony, and James Bond-style parachute escape, it's not surprising that the mystery of D.B. Cooper has become an American legend. Will the identity of this infamous pirate of the skies ever be unmasked? On November 24, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving, a man paid cash for a ticket on Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 from Portland to Seattle. The plane was a Boeing 727 with stairs at the back of the plane. This would prove important later. He used the name Dan Cooper, which later became D.B. Cooper due to a media miscommunication. Based on eyewitness testimony, Cooper was in his 40s, approximately 5 feet 10 inches to 6 feet tall, and weighed 180 pounds with dark hair. He wore a black suit, white shirt, narrow black clip-on tie with tie clip, a black overcoat, and dress shoes, and was carrying an attaché case. Cooper ordered a bourbon and soda before takeoff from a flight attendant and later handed her a note written in all caps. It read, "I have a bomb in my briefcase. I will use it if necessary. I want you to sit next to me. You are being hijacked." He opened his attaché case to reveal wires and colored sticks, then dictated another note demanding 4 parachutes and $200,000 in $20 bills. When the plane landed in Seattle, Cooper exchanged the passengers for the parachutes and money, forcing the crew to remain on the plane with him. They took off once more, set a course for Mexico, and at a little past 8 p.m., Cooper jumped from the plane using those back stairs into a remote wilderness area somewhere between Seattle and the refueling stop in Reno, never to be seen again. The strangest thing about D.B. Cooper's case is that no one can even agree on whether or not he would have survived his nighttime jump into the wilderness. Most evidence suggests he died, as there were a lot of things working against him. He was more appropriately dressed for a wedding than a skydive and wintertime survival in the western wilderness. He missed key details about the equipment he was given, including the fact that his reserve parachute was a training version and was sewn shut. And that parachute? There was no way for him to steer. FBI Special Agent Larry Carr put it this way: "No experienced parachutist would have jumped in the pitch-black night in the rain with a 200-mile-an-hour wind in his face, wearing loafers and a trench coat. It was simply too risky." It's no secret that some people just don't care about risk, but perhaps most telling is that some of the ransom money was recovered in 1980. A young boy found a package of rotting $20 bills along the Columbia River near Vancouver, which many believe is the final piece of evidence that he died making his escape. If Cooper did land safely and is still alive, he'd be in his late 80s or early 90s today. Investigators do have a major piece of evidence: Cooper's black clip-on tie, removed before he jumped. DNA analysis done in 2007 revealed 3 different DNA samples, but there's no way of knowing if any belonged to Cooper. A match has never been found, and even if it was, it's not enough evidence to positively identify and convict the hijacker. In 2017, a group called Citizen Sleuths ran a full-scale analysis of the tie using an electron microscope that turned up over 100,000 particles, including rare earth elements and other corrosion-resistant metals. That's led to the belief Cooper may have worked in the aerospace or electronics industries. The FBI has investigated more than 1,000 suspects, some more serious than others. One of the higher-profile suspects in the case was Richard Floyd McCoy, who was arrested by the FBI for a similar airplane hijacking just months after D.B. Cooper's flight. McCoy later died in a gunfight with federal authorities and was eliminated as a suspect for the D.B. Cooper case based mostly on eyewitness descriptions of the hijacker. Other suspects were brought to the public's attention by relatives. In 2011, a woman named Marla Cooper publicly suggested her uncle was actually D.B. Cooper. Lynn Doyle Cooper, who went by LD, was a Korean War veteran who his niece says was involved in a strange Thanksgiving plot and an accident in 1971. DNA evidence failed to connect the dots. Kenneth Christensen became a suspect after his brother Lyle made the connection between Cooper and his brother after watching an episode of Unsolved Mysteries and seeing the composite sketch of Cooper. Not long before his death, Kenneth hinted that there was something he needed to confess, but actual evidence is unfortunately completely lacking. On July 12, 2016, the FBI formally closed the D.B. Cooper case after what it called one of the longest and most exhaustive investigations in our history. The Bureau stated it had followed all credible leads and evidence, but was unable to positively identify D.B. Cooper or his whereabouts. But it wasn't over. In 2018, D.B. Cooper was in the headlines again. This time, a team of investigators announced that the real Cooper was Vietnam veteran Robert Rackstraw. Not only was Rackstraw former Special Forces, but he had a ton of relevant work experience and had used at least 22 aliases through the years. Their main piece of evidence was a handful of typewritten letters, which they said could be decoded into confessions. The team, which included a number of former FBI agents, also claimed the Bureau had protected Rackstraw because he knew too many government secrets. Rackstraw still lives in San Francisco, and when asked about the allegations, this happened.
If you're D.B. Cooper, the world would want to know your story.
I would. So would the FBI.
Is it settled? You decide.
The brutal death of a child beauty queen, a town bombarded by blobs from the sky, and the biggest rap mystery of an entire generation. These cases have grown cold, but they're still raising questions. Amber Hagerman was 9 years old in 1996 when she rode her bike in the parking lot of a grocery store just a stone's throw from her grandmother's home. She would have had no idea that her life was about to come to a tragic end. A single witness came forward saying that they'd seen someone driving a truck grab Hagerman off her bike.
Arlington 911, what are you reporting?
Yeah, I saw a black pickup and he grabbed a little girl and he took off toward town with her.
The local Arlington, Texas Police Department was on high alert. Her kidnapping was covered by national media outlets, but in the end, it didn't matter. Her body was recovered 4 days later. She'd been killed and dumped in a creek. In 2021, police issued another appeal for new information, and Cairo 7 News reported that there still may be a good chance for justice. Police had DNA from the cold case and were going to be making yet another attempt to take advantage of new technologies to try to find a match. As tragic as Hagerman's disappearance and death was, a considerable amount of good has come from it. After her murder, broadcasters and law enforcement worked together to create the Amber Alert system. In addition to being adopted across the US, the Amber Alert system is also in use in Europe, where 18 countries use it to notify the public of missing or kidnapped children. In just 81 minutes on March 18, 1990, 2 people walked into the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, restrained the 2 guards on duty, and stole around $500 million worth of art. One piece alone, one of only about 34 surviving paintings by Johannes Vermeer, was worth a whopping $250 million. Other stolen works included Rembrandt's Christ in the Storm on the Sea of Galilee, a few other Rembrandts, some sketches by Edgar Degas, and strangest of all, the museum's most valuable painting by Titian was left behind. In spite of the fact that the museum continues to offer a $10 million reward to anyone who comes forward with information that helps them recover the paintings, not a single work has yet been recovered. Clues, however, are still lingering. In 2021, NBC Boston reported that a then-local jeweler had come forward with testimony that one longtime suspect, Bobby Donati, had approached him with one of the pieces stolen in the heist. That report came on the heels of the death of another suspect, Robert Gentile. Gentile had connections with the mob, but always denied that he had anything to do with the theft. The museum has never removed the empty frames where the 13 stolen pieces once hung, and they remain as a reminder of one of the decade's biggest mysteries. On December 6, 1991, emergency responders rushed to put out a fire in a yogurt shop in Austin, Texas. Once the flames were out, they were shocked by what they saw, the remains of 4 girls. The teenagers had been tied up, shot, and left in the building as it was set on fire. Any evidence that may have been left behind was destroyed in the blaze, and investigations led nowhere until 4 men were arrested in 1999. But although the men confessed, they later said they were innocent and had only confessed under interrogation. The 2 who had been convicted had those convictions overturned on appeal, and the case remains unsolved. Law enforcement believed from the beginning that multiple people were involved in the deaths of 13-year-old Amy Ayers, 15-year-old Sarah Harbison, and 17-year-olds Jennifer Harbison and Eliza Thomas. Leads came and fizzled, and the case dragged on. Still, there's a chance this may be solved someday. In early 2022, CBS News reported that one of the victims had been sexually assaulted, and the fire hadn't destroyed DNA evidence. Recovered along with the rounds from the weapons used, the hope is that advances in DNA technology will allow law enforcement to finally get a match and bring the killers to justice.
Once my life is gone, it's gone. Can't nobody give it back to me. Not the judge, not the president, not the governor. They can't do nothing but come to my funeral and talk pretty.
It was right after Mike Tyson put an end to a fight in 109 seconds on September 7, 1996, that Tupac Shakur was caught on camera for what would be the last time. He was walking through the MGM Grand when he saw a gang member that had a previous altercation with one of his Death Row Record associates, and the following fight was over quickly. Shakur walked away and was shot 2 hours later as he sat at a stoplight. Shakur died 6 days later of 4 gunshot wounds, and no one was ever arrested. There are a ton of theories about just what went down that night, and as the journalist, filmmaker, and producer of the series Who Killed Tupac, Stephanie Frederick, explained to the Las Vegas Review-Journal, there's too many dirty details, too many people who will come under fire, too many secrets that will probably get out that shouldn't be out. There's so many entanglements. And there were a ton of witnesses. Shakur was, at the time he was shot, sitting in a line of cars filled with what was described as his death row entourage. While they all would have seen the white Cadillac and the shooter, everyone has refused to talk. Law enforcement places a lack of arrest squarely on the shoulders of the silent witnesses, and the killing remains unsolved. June 16, 1991 was like any other day at the United Bank Tower in Denver, Colorado, until it wasn't. That was a day that an armed man went into the bank, shot and killed 4 security guards, and left with around $200,000 in cash. The following year saw a massive trial broadcast across the nation. James King was a retired Denver police officer and had worked as a security guard at the bank before he was arrested for the killings and the theft. There were a lot of strong feelings around the trial, with some pointing to the fact that there was no actual evidence that it was him as a major red flag, while others were convinced that he was definitely the guy. King was ultimately acquitted, but until his death in 2013, he remained under constant surveillance by the FBI and under just as constant suspicion. In 2021, the Toronto Sun did a refresher on the case and noted that there was still no official verdict. In spite of the evidence being circumstantial at best, law enforcement still claimed that the right guy had gone free, but not everyone is convinced. 2021 saw the 25th anniversary of one of the highest profile murder cases in the country, the death of 6-year-old JonBenet Ramsey. Initially believed to be a kidnapping, police were called after Patsy Ramsey found a ransom note asking for $118,000 for her daughter's safe return. Police went to the house and hours went by, a full 8 hours. And that's when one detective told Ramsey's father John to look around the house to see if he noticed anything odd. When he went into the basement, he found his daughter. She had been strangled, beaten, and wrapped in a blanket. What followed was what could accurately be described as a media feeding frenzy, and the bottom line is that no one was ever brought to justice for the little girl's death. The list of suspects was a long one. It included both of her parents, who were officially exonerated, along with her older brother Burke, who has maintained his innocence.
Did you hit your sister over the head with a baseball bat or a flashlight?
Absolutely not.
Other suspects include a convicted sex offender and drifter named Gary Oliva, and a local electrician, both of whom were cleared on the basis of DNA. Then there was a teacher who gave a confession that was ultimately deemed false, their housekeeper, whose involvement was based on only circumstantial evidence, and a local man who dressed up as the town's Santa. Rolling Stone called the idea of his involvement the sensationalized character assassination of a friendly old man. JonBenet Ramsey's murder remains unsolved. Not all unsolved mysteries involve murders, so let's look at one that's just downright weird. On August 7, 1994, residents of Oakville, Washington woke to a strange sight. Overnight, weird gelatinous blobs had fallen from the sky and covered everything. They weren't just gross, reports the BBC's Science Focus, they were also dangerous. Residents blamed the blobs for the flu-like sickness that quickly started making the rounds. Doctors recorded higher than normal instances of inner ear problems, major respiratory problems, and vertigo in the days after the event. Some, like Beverly Roberts, suffered such bad vertigo that she had to crawl to her car to make it to the doctor. She was hospitalized for a week.
Everybody in the whole town came down with like a flu, only it was a really hard flu. It didn't last like 7 days, it lasted like 7 weeks, 2 or 3 months.
Even more disturbing were the deaths of any animals who happened to eat the jelly. They died almost immediately after ingesting the substance. Death came with vomiting green foam, and scores met this tragic fate. There's never been a satisfactory explanation for what the jellies were, and yes, they've been analyzed. The results cleared up absolutely nothing. The official results from the Washington Department of Health said that the blobs contained illness-causing bacteria, but weirdly, none of the illnesses any of the victims suffered, along with white blood cells of human origin. No one has any idea what was going on. Employees at the Las Cruces bowling alley were getting ready to open on February 10, 1990, when 2 men forced their way in and told the manager, Stephanie Sinek, her 12-year-old daughter and her daughter's 13-year-old friend to get on the floor. After another employee, Steve Turan, walked in with his 2- and 6-year-old daughters, the killing began. Turan and his daughters were killed instantly, and although Sinek survived, she later died of complications. Amy Hauser, 13, was also killed. The 2 men left with somewhere around $5,000 and were never caught. Law enforcement and the families of the victims are still hopeful that they might be brought to justice someday, because while there was no DNA evidence recovered, there were plenty of fingerprints. Turan's brother Anthony is pretty sure they won't see justice. He told the Las Cruces Sun News, "I can almost guarantee that those 2 guys are dead. By their lifestyle, because if you can shoot a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old in the forehead, you can do anything. Nothing's going to bother you." Between 1993 and 1998, women disappeared from an area of Ireland that was given the name of the Vanishing Triangle. The points of the triangle were in the counties of Wexford, Louth, and Offaly, and within the bounds of these points, at least 8 women vanished, some in broad daylight, and were never seen or heard from again. Remains have never been discovered, and according to what writer Claire McGowan found when she wrote a book on the cold case, it's not even clear just how many women there are. The usual number is 8, and their stories are varied. Deidre Jacob, for example, vanished from just outside of her home in the middle of the afternoon. Ciara Breen was 17 when she vanished one night, and Annie McCarrick was an American student last seen at a pub in the Dublin Mountains. McGowan found others that fit the same profile, 15-year-old Arlene Atkinson from Castledirk, for example. McGowan suspects a serial killer. She told the Irish Times, "I have a hard time believing that each of these missing 8 women was murdered by 8 different men. I think some of them were done by the same person. Without remains, though, that's made it tough to connect the victims or even start trying to compile suspect lists. There have never been any arrests or trials, but they haven't been forgotten." The Roaring '20s might conjure up images of flapper dresses and bootleggers, but the decade had a darker side. Will the era's unsolved murders and mysterious disappearances remain unresolved forever? Will we ever know what really happened when Agatha Christie became part of a real-life mystery? Good questions. The death of Virginia Rappe and the subsequent trial of actor Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle was one of the biggest scandals of the 1920s. Although Arbuckle was found not guilty, it's still unclear exactly what led to Rappe's death. According to Smithsonian Magazine, Rappe and Arbuckle were at a party together at the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco on September 5, 1921. Arbuckle claimed that after having a few drinks with Rappe, she became hysterical, and he soon found her vomiting in the bathroom. Believing she just had too much to drink, Arbuckle and a few other guests moved her to a private room. When her condition didn't improve for 3 days, she was finally taken to the hospital. There, doctors discovered that she'd had a ruptured bladder, which led to her death on September 9th. At the hospital, Rappe's friend Maud Delmont claimed that Arbuckle had sexually assaulted Rappe and the attack had caused her death. No evidence was found to support the claim, but the BBC also notes that before being taken to the hospital, Rappe also claimed, quote, "He did this to me." As a result, both Rappe and Arbuckle were disparaged in the papers, which wrote either about Arbuckle's weight causing the ruptured bladder during the alleged assault or blamed Rappe's potential venereal diseases. According to urology case reports, a ruptured bladder most commonly occurs during abdominal trauma, but can occur if there's chronic inflammation. And while it's suspected that Rapp suffered from cystitis, which may have led to the ruptured bladder, no one will ever know exactly what happened to the aspiring actress. Known as the Lava Lake Murders, the killing of Ed Nichols, Roy Wilson, and Dewey Morris was one of the most gruesome murders Oregon witnessed during the 1920s. And although the police had a main suspect, insufficient evidence meant that the crime remains officially unsolved to this day. Nichols, Wilson, and Morris lived and worked as trappers during the winter months, staying in an isolated cabin in Little Lava Lake. Those who saw them that winter would later say that everything seemed fine, and they didn't seem to suspect they wouldn't live to see the spring. The last anyone had seen or heard from the men was around January 15th, so by April, the families became worried and ventured out to the cabin. Reports say that the cabin was found abandoned, and it looked as though no one had been there for at least 2 months. And in the nearby storage shed, they also found a blood-stained hammer. Before long, they discovered the bodies of the 3 men. All 3 had gunshot wounds, likely from a shotgun blast.
I'd be very surprised if our suspect was from Brainerd.
Yeah. After hearing that a former Elk Lake Lodge employee named Charles Kimsey had threatened one of the trappers, a $1,000 reward was offered for Kimsey's capture. But even with the reward, it took years to find Kimsey, and in the end, no one was able to prove that he was responsible. Thomas H. Ince was one of the most influential figures in the silent film industry during the beginning of the 20th century, but the circumstances of his death remain unknown to this day. Theories are wild, with some even claiming that newspaper mogul William Randolph Hearst was responsible. On November 16, 1924, Ince boarded the Oneida, Hearst's yacht, for a weekend excursion for Ince's 42nd birthday. There were some business deals going on as well. They were also finalizing negotiations that would give Hearst access to Ince's film studio. There were a number of other celebrities on the yacht, including actor Charlie Chaplin, Hearst's longtime live-in girlfriend Marion Davies, and columnist Luella Parsons. A dinner was held for Ince's birthday, but Ince allegedly left the dinner early due to stomach cramps. When the cramps worsened, Ince left the yacht and traveled back to Los Angeles with his family. 3 days later, on November 19th, Ince was dead, and the doctor put down the cause of death as heart failure. But according to the New England Historical Society, rumors soon spread that Ince had been shot on the yacht after Hearst caught Chaplin and Davies together. The theory goes that Hearst hit Ince by mistake in an attempt to shoot Chaplin. And while it's unclear exactly what led to Ince's death, there have been suggestions that there was some shady stuff going on, and gifts may have been given in exchange for silence. But since Ince's body ended up being cremated incredibly quickly, it's impossible to confirm what exactly happened. Casper Holstein was one of the richest mobsters in New York City during the 1920s. It's possible that his wealth, most of which came from his Harlem numbers racket or even his philanthropy towards the black community, made him a target for one of the unsolved kidnappings of the 1920s. In September 1928, Holstein was kidnapped by 5 white men who, according to the New York Times, demanded a ransom of $50,000. That's no small sum, and adjusted for inflation, that's around $700,000 today. Holstein ended up being released after 3 days, but he repeatedly insisted that the ransom wasn't paid. Strangely, even after being released, Holstein refused to identify his kidnappers, even when it appeared as though the police had caught them. As a result, nobody was arrested in connection with the kidnapping, and no one knows exactly what happened. Holstein told reporters that he could in fact identify the kidnappers, but he kept quiet due to business reasons. However, one of the main rumors that circulated claimed that another mobster, Dutch Schultz, set up the kidnapping in order to take over the gambling scene in Harlem. But at the end of the day, no one but Holstein knows exactly what happened over those 3 days of being taken hostage.
The truth, yes. The truth, it's so difficult to tell.
During the 1920s, the Purple Gang had a firm grip on the bootleg industry in Detroit, but their legacy came from more than just bootlegging. During their reign, the Purple Gang is thought to have been responsible for hundreds of gang-related murders, rivaled only by Murder, Inc. and Al Capone's crew. But some of their killings, like the Mila Flores massacre, remain unsolved to this day. The Mila Flores massacre is thought to have originated with the murder of Johnny Reed in 1921. Reed was one of the biggest distributors for the Purple Gang, and so the gang decided to retaliate after he was killed. However, it's unclear why the retaliation would have taken another 6 years to plan, making the connection a little odd. But on March 28, 1927, it's believed the Purple Gang lured Frank Wright and 2 other men whom they thought were responsible for Reed's murder into the Mila Flores apartments in Detroit. There, the 3 men were allegedly mowed down by the Purple Gang in what became known as the first machine gun slaying in state history. The apartment where the crime took place was leased by Eddie Fletcher and Abe Axler, both members of the Purple Gang. But in the end, nobody ended up being charged with the crime. B.H. DeLay started out as a race car driver, but eventually took his daredevil skills to the skies and created his own company to perform aerial stunts for motion pictures. DeLay was no stranger to danger, but in 1923, his luck seemed to run out. On July 4, 1923, DeLay was performing for a crowd at Ocean Park. The performance seemed to be going fine, but then in the middle of a loop-the-loop, the wings of his plane folded back, causing the plane to crash down nose first. The plane soon burst into flames, and although DeLay and his passenger were pulled out of the wreck, neither survived the crash. Upon further inspection, it was found that the pins in the airplane's wings had been tampered with, and that the accident was no accident after all. It was a result of sabotage. To this day, no one knows who was responsible for DeLay's murder. However, just a few days before the crash, someone reportedly shot at DeLay in Clover Field, so the sabotaged plane was clearly just another attempt to finish the job. Although Italian anarchists were blamed for the Wall Street bombing in 1920, no one was ever convicted for the bombing. One would think that an attack on the burgeoning financial capital of the United States would warrant an intense investigation, but within 20 years, even the FBI had given up. On the morning of September 16, 1920, witnesses claimed that they saw a wagon park outside J.P. Morgan & Company Bank, and the driver left the wagon unattended. And then, 1 minute after noon, a massive explosion rocked the area, shattering windows across a half-mile radius. Up to 300 100 people were injured and at least 40 people were killed, largely due to the 500 pounds of shrapnel that was packed alongside the explosive. But the next day, the New York Stock Exchange building was back up and running, and sheets were used to cover up the horrors left over from the day before. The so-called American anarchist fighters were blamed due to the leaflets found near the explosion site, according to the FBI. But although many anarchists were picked up during the Palmer raids, no one was ever charged in connection with the 1920 Wall Street bombing. It only seems fair that one of the most acclaimed mystery writers would be involved in a mind-boggling mystery of her own, and that's exactly what happened on December 3, 1926. Mystery writer Agatha Christie left her home in Sunningdale, Berkshire after arguing with her husband, Archibald Christie. She wrote a note for her secretary saying she wouldn't be coming home that night and left her house with a briefcase taking the family's car. What happened over the next 11 days is something that only Christie knows. Archie reported his wife missing the day after she left, and soon her car was found abandoned with her clothes and driver's license left inside. Police immediately began to question Archie, who was the last person to see her alive, and tried to pressure him into confessing while they continued to search for her. But then, all of a sudden, Christie was spotted alive and well in a Yorkshire spa, which is where her brother-in-law told the police she might be. But for some reason, she was registered under an assumed name. Upon being found, Christie claimed that she had amnesia and was suffering from, quote, the most complete loss of memory, a claim she maintained even in her own memoir. Was it a fugue state? Or was Christie just tired of her cheating husband? This is one mystery that Agatha Christie took to her grave.
What are murderers like?
Well, you.
Francisco Pancho Villa was a key figure of the Mexican Revolution, but by 1920 he'd largely retreated out of politics and guerrilla warfare. Villa retired to his 163,000-acre hacienda at Canutillo and rarely left over the next 3 years. And whenever he did, around 50 armed bodyguards went with him. But then in July 1923, Villa set off to the town of Parral with only a few of the armed bodyguards he typically traveled with. There he attended the baptism and was named godfather to the child of one of his men. On July 20th, Villa was driving back to Canutillo, but as he drove down a street in Parral, he was assassinated as someone shot at him from a house along the way. The El Paso Times reported that the assassins were believed to be deserters from Villa's team of personal bodyguards, but is that really all they were? The assassins never ended up being caught, and it was clear that the killing was well organized, especially since telegraph lines out of Parral had been cut and communications had been severed. Although Jesus Salas Barraza soon claimed responsibility for the assassination, this allowed higher officials to evade responsibility, even though the plot likely went all the way up to President Álvaro Obregón. The former general had lost an arm fighting Villa's men in 1915, and that's what they call motive. Anastasia told part of this story, but there's more to the full saga of the last Russian royal family, the Romanovs. Keep watching to learn what we know and what we don't about their bloody end. It was 1915 and World War I was in full force. The last Russian Tsar, Nikolai II, headed to the Russian front line in a final attempt to keep the Romanov dynasty's authority alive. Riots and rebellions were increasing in Russia due to the lack of food and supplies and the high death toll of war. The threat of revolution was becoming a reality. Then, in March 1917, Bolshevik revolutionaries forced Nikolai to abdicate, effectively leading to the collapse of the Russian monarchy. When offers of exile to Great Britain fell through, the family was forced into house arrest at Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, a town just 15 miles south of St. Petersburg. While life inside the palace was fairly normal for the Romanovs, guards followed the royals when they went out for walks. By August 1917, the provisional government was afraid that the unstable political situation in the main cities could get violent. They decided to move the imperial family further away for their own safety. The Romanovs were then taken to the governor's palace in a very small Siberian town of Tobolsk. 46 court attendants, including servants, joined the 5-day train trip to the family's new residence. The Romanovs enjoyed a fairly relaxed, almost happy life at the palace until April of the following year, when orders came that they had to move again. The family and servants then headed for their new and final residence at the Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg. Life was very different at the Ipatiev house, which was a small mansion, but still a far cry from the luxury the imperial family was used to. Alexei was often ill, and the Romanov daughters endured disrespectful behavior from the guards on a regular basis. Except for short walks in the garden, the Romanovs spent most of their time in 5 small rooms on the second floor of the house. By the beginning of July, the usual guards were replaced by men from the Cheka secret police. A few days later, they would be given the go-ahead from Moscow to kill the entire family. Just after midnight on July 17, 1918, the family was woken up and taken to a room in the basement. They were told that revolutionaries were approaching and the family would be safer downstairs. The family's physician, cook, a chambermaid, and a footman joined the family in the basement. After some time, Secret Police Commander Yakov Yurovsky walked into the room, announced the family had been sentenced to death, and shot the Tsar. While Nikolai II died instantly, the rest of the family did not. Yurovsky's guards then opened fire, filling the room with smoke and causing them to miss their targets. Some of the victims were shot several times, and others were bayoneted to death, stabbed, or attacked with the butts of the guns. It took over 20 minutes before everybody was dead. It took several tries, which included a mine shaft, grenades, and acid, before Yurovsky and his men finally dug a shallow grave for most of the bodies. The remains of 2 of the children were burned and buried elsewhere. While the revolutionary Bolsheviks took credit for killing Nikolai II, the murder of the imperial family remained a well-guarded secret for decades. It wasn't until 1979 that the mass grave was found, though things remained quiet until an investigation was launched in 1991. Once DNA confirmed the remains belonged to the Romanovs, the family, except for the 2 missing children, was buried in St. Petersburg Cathedral. Not long after, they were declared saints in the Russian Orthodox Church. But things weren't so simple for the other 2 children, who were suspected to be Alexei and either Maria or Anastasia. For starters, their bodies weren't found until 2007, and despite DNA analysis proving their lineage, the Russian Orthodox Church refused to acknowledge the findings. New DNA tests confirmed the findings in 2015 when Tsar Nicholas II's body was exhumed for DNA comparison. But in 2018, the church still insisted that, quote, more proof was needed. The church claimed they needed to be extra careful in confirming the identity of the children. They claimed their bones were considered sacred relics because of the family's canonization. The truth, however, is possibly a lot more political than religious. The grave containing the remains of the 2 children was located in 2007, not far from the main burial site, but the bodies had been burned almost completely to ash. While it's true that fewer than 50 bone fragments were found, DNA tests were conclusive. They belonged to members of the Romanov family. The bodies of Alexei and Maria have never been buried. They remain in hold at a Russian state archive because the church demands more proof that it really is them. Conspiracy theories could have come into play too. For years, there was speculation that the 2 missing children hadn't been found because they had somehow escaped and were still alive. Between 1918 and 1928, half a dozen women publicly claimed to be the missing Romanov daughter. The most famous case was the story of Anastasia Tchaikovsky, also known as Anna Anderson, who claimed to be the missing Anastasia. Anderson had spent some time in a mental hospital after a suicide attempt and was eventually helped by Romanov sympathizers to escape to the US. There, she engaged in a long legal battle to be recognized as Anastasia Romanov. She eventually lost her court battle and died in 1984. A DNA test performed a decade later proved Anderson was definitely not a Romanov.